Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in the history of Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, let me invite you to share in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're curious to know where and when these chilling accounts reach people around the world. The towering pines of the Ozark Mountains have witnessed countless stories over generations, but few are as strange and haunting as what took place during the winter of 1915. Deep in the rolling hills of southern Missouri, in a place where mist clings to the valleys and sunlight barely cuts through the dense forest canopy, lies one of the darkest and least known chapters of American scientific history, the case of Clara Caldwell. December 18, 1915. A bitterly cold morning in Shannon County, Missouri. The Caldwell family home stood isolated on a ridge overlooking Jack's Fork River, about 7 miles from the nearest town of Eminence. Sheriff Thomas Lawson was called to property after neighbors reported not seeing any sign of life for almost 2 weeks. What he found would baffle the scientific community for decades. Inside, 12-year-old Clara Caldwell was discovered alone, surrounded by dozens of notebooks filled with mathematical equations and scientific drawings so advanced that experts later claimed it was impossible for a child her age and education to have created them. Her parents, Robert and Mary Caldwell, were gone. The house was immaculate. No sign of a struggle, no trace of foul play. Just a young girl with an inexplicable knowledge that seemed to have appeared overnight and parents who had vanished without a trace. What makes this case so deeply disturbing is not only the disappearance itself, but what was found inside those notebooks, pages that challenge our understanding of memory, human intelligence, and the very limits of what we think is possible. Some researchers believe Clara's case represents a phenomenon science still cannot explain: the sudden, untraceable acquisition of knowledge. Before we dig deeper, it's important to note that what you're about to hear comes from fragmented sources. The sheriff's reports from Shannon County, medical evaluations conducted at Missouri State Hospital No. 4, and surviving academic papers written by researchers who studied Clara between 1915 and 1918. Many of these records were later sealed, and some were reportedly destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1947. What survives are transcribed interviews, newspaper clippings, and eyewitness accounts from those who encountered Clara in the years following her parents' disappearance. This is the documented story of Clara Caldwell, the girl whose mind became a vessel for knowledge no one could explain, and the terrible price that came with it. The Caldwell family had moved to Shannon County in the spring of 1913. Robert Caldwell, a former railroad engineer from St. Louis, had inherited a modest piece of land from a distant uncle. By all accounts, the family kept to themselves but were not considered unusual by local standards. Robert occasionally worked odd jobs in town, while Mary sold preserves and quilts at the general store. Clara, their only child, was described by the local schoolteacher, Miss Elena Whitman, as quiet but intelligent, with a particular talent for arithmetic. Nothing about the family's past suggested anything remarkable. Robert had completed 8 grades of schooling before going to work on the railroad. Mary had slightly more education and had worked briefly as a shop assistant in St. Louis before marrying. Clara attended the small one-room schoolhouse in Eminence when weather allowed, though the 7-mile journey became increasingly difficult as winter closed in during late 1915. Neighbors told Sheriff Lawson that the Caldwells were private but kind. Hiram Jenkins, who owned the nearest farm, recalled, "They didn't mix much in town affairs, but Robert was always ready to lend a hand when someone needed help." Mary made the best blackberry preserves around. The girl was quiet, always reading whenever you saw her. Their cabin had 3 rooms, a living space with a kitchen and 2 small bedrooms. Heated by a single wood stove and lit by kerosene lamps, the home was simple but comfortable. There was no electricity this far out in 1915. Nothing suggested what was about to happen. There were no reports of strange visitors, odd purchases, or unusual behavior. The last confirmed sighting of Robert and Mary Caldwell came on December 4th, 1915, when Robert bought supplies at Wilson's General Store. The ledger, still preserved in the Shannon County Historical Society, lists the purchases: flour, coffee, sugar, kerosene, and a tablet of paper. Store owner Elias Wilson later told Sheriff Lawson that Robert seemed completely normal that day, maybe a little distracted about the coming snow, but nothing unusual. He did mention that Robert said Clara had been unusually eager in her studies and had asked for more paper. That would be the last time anyone saw Robert Caldwell alive. For nearly 2 weeks, there was no sign of the family. This was not entirely unusual during heavy snow, but when no smoke rose from their chimney, despite the bitter cold, neighbor Hiram Jenkins alerted Sheriff Lawson. What they found inside the Caldwell home that December morning became the first chapter of one of the most haunting and unexplained cases in Ozark history, a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. The path leading to the Caldwell cabin wound through thick pine forest, crossing Jack's Fork River by a narrow footbridge. Sheriff Lawson and Hiram Jenkins set out early and reached the property around 10 a.m. on December 18th, after trudging through nearly 2 feet of snow. Jenkins would later recall in a sworn statement, still preserved in county records, that something felt wrong the moment they crossed that bridge. No tracks in the snow, no smoke, no sound, not even birds, he said. It was like that cabin was holding its breath. Sheriff Lawson knocked several times, but there was no answer. The door was unlocked, unusual for such a remote home. Inside, the air was frigid. The house was spotless, almost unnervingly so. The wood stove in the main room held only cold ash. A half-empty teacup sat on the table, its contents frozen solid. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of a hurried departure. Robert and Mary's coats still hung by the door. Their few valuables, Mary's silver brooch, Robert's pocket watch, rested untouched on the mantel. In the main bedroom, the bed was perfectly made, as though it hadn't been used for days. Robert's boots stood neatly by the bedside. Mary's hairbrush sat on the vanity, dark strands still caught in the bristles. But it was in Clara's small bedroom that Sheriff Lawson made the discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Clara sat at a small desk by the window, alive, but in what the sheriff later described as a trance-like state. She didn't react to their presence or answer questions. Strangely, her room was warm, the only warm place in the house, yet no fire burned anywhere. The walls were covered with drawings, equations, and diagrams. Some were pinned up, others scrawled directly onto the wooden boards. The desk was buried under notebooks, each one filled with dense writing and complex mathematical formulas. Sheriff Lawson, though not highly educated, knew enough to recognize that what he was seeing was far beyond the ability of a typical 12-year-old girl. Even more unsettling were Clara's hands, stained with ink up to the wrists, as if she had been writing for days without rest. When Lawson gently touched her shoulder, she turned her head slowly, her eyes focusing with visible effort. Then she spoke the words that he would record in his official report. "They're gone. They had to go. The numbers needed room." Lawson immediately sent Jenkins back to town for the doctor and stayed with Clara. In his notes, he wrote that she slowly became more responsive, drinking water when offered but refusing food. She kept writing, pausing only when directly spoken to. When asked again about her parents, she simply repeated, "They had to make room." Dr. William Hayes arrived that evening. His medical report, later cited in academic papers, described Clara as physically healthy but mentally altered. Her pulse, temperature, and reflexes were normal, but her behavior was not. "The child displays a singular focus on mathematical and scientific notation beyond my comprehension," Dr. Hayes wrote. "She speaks clearly when addressed, but immediately returns to her work when left alone. Most troubling is her lack of distress over her parents' disappearance." That night, Clara was taken to the Hayes home in Eminence for observation. Meanwhile, Sheriff Lawson and several deputies searched the property and surrounding woods. They found nothing, no footprints, no clues, no sign of Robert or Mary Caldwell. In the days that followed, Lawson organized wider and wider search parties. Men from neighboring communities joined, combing the frozen forest, dragging sections of Jack's Fork River, even searching the many abandoned mines and caves scattered across the Ozarks. Still, no trace of the missing couple was ever found. Back in Eminence, Clara remained under constant watch. Dr. Hayes' wife, Judith, kept a detailed journal of the girl's behavior, notes that would later become critical evidence. She wrote that Clara barely slept, ate only when food was placed directly in front of her, and spent nearly every waking moment writing. When paper ran out, she would write on anything available. Torn out pages from books, scrap wood, even the walls. On December 21st, Judith Hayes wrote, Clara filled 7 entire tablets today with what William says are advanced mathematical and scientific formulas. When I asked her where she learned such things, she looked at me as if I had spoken another language. I didn't learn them, she said. They're just there now. The child shows no grief over her parents' absence, which troubles me greatly. It is as though she has either forgotten them entirely, or worse, sees their disappearance as irrelevant. Word of the strange case quickly spread through Shannon County and beyond. On December 23rd, Professor James Morgan of the University of Missouri arrived in Eminence, having traveled from Columbia after hearing of the bizarre situation through a colleague. Morgan, a mathematician with a fascination for prodigies, was skeptical at first, but when he met Clara, his skepticism vanished. In a letter to his department chair, later published in the university's academic journal, Morgan wrote, "What I witnessed today defies rational explanation. This child, with no access to higher education or Clara's work shocked everyone who examined it. She was producing material in non-Euclidean geometry, differential equations, and what appeared to be theoretical physics, the kind of work that would challenge graduate students at the nation's top universities." Professor Morgan spent 3 days reviewing Clara's notebooks. With permission from Sheriff Lawson, who had been named her temporary guardian, Morgan brought several pages back to the university for analysis. Experts confirmed that the work was not only legitimate, but included entirely new approaches to existing problems in both mathematics and physics. The most disturbing part was Clara's own explanation of how she came by this knowledge. When Professor Morgan asked her directly, she replied with chilling simplicity, "I went to sleep, and when I woke up, the numbers were there. They're so loud now, they needed more room." By early January 1916, Clara's case had drawn attention from scientists and physicians across the Midwest. The search for Robert and Mary Caldwell had been scaled back. Most locals believed the couple had either perished in the wilderness or abandoned Clara for reasons unknown. Neither theory explained what had happened to the girl herself. On January 12, 1916, at the recommendation of Dr. Hayes and Professor Morgan, Clara was transferred to Missouri State Hospital No. 4 in Farmington for further study. Her admission record, preserved in state archives, lists her condition as acute mental alteration of unknown origin with somnambulistic manifestations. What followed was a battery of examinations that only deepened the mystery and raised disturbing questions about the nature of knowledge, consciousness, and what might happen when something unknown takes root in a human mind. The journey from Eminence to Farmington took nearly 2 days by wagon and train in the deep January snow. According to Dr. Hayes' notes, Clara remained quiet but compliant. During the train ride, she filled 14 pages with calculations. When Hayes asked what she was working on, she replied, "The motion of the train, the vibrations have patterns. I have to record them." Missouri State Hospital No. 4, founded in 1903, was considered one of the most progressive facilities of its time. Its director, Dr. Franklin Pierce, favored a scientific approach, studying patients rather than simply confining them. Clara was placed in the children's ward under the supervision of Dr. Elena Reed, one of Missouri's few practicing female psychiatrists at the time. Dr. Reed's detailed notes provide the most complete record of Clara's condition during those first months of 1916. Patient exhibits extraordinary cognitive abilities in mathematics, physics, and astronomy despite having no prior exposure to such advanced concepts. Physical examination shows no abnormalities. Neurological tests normal. Patient is oriented to person in place, but demonstrates an altered perception time, frequently confusing recent events with distant memories. Dr. Reed conducted multiple interviews with Clara, transcripts of which were kept in hospital archives until they were reportedly classified and removed by government officials in 1954. Copies of several sessions, however, survive in Professor Morgan's personal papers, which were donated to University of Missouri after his death. One session, dated February 1916, stands out. Dr. Reed: Clara, can you tell me how you know the things you write? Clara: I told you, they're just there now. Dr. Reed: but these are ideas even most adults wouldn't understand. You didn't know them before December, correct? Clara: before the cold night, before they went away. Dr. Reed: your parents? Clara: they had to make room. Dr. Reed: what was getting crowded, Clara? Clara: long pause, my head. But it's not just my head anymore. It goes all the way down now. Sometimes I can feel in my fingers and toes. The knowing. Dr. Reed: did something happen that cold night? Clara: the sky opened. Not for everyone. Just for me. It poured in like water, but it wasn't wet. It was heavy like honey, but sharper. They tried to make it stop. They couldn't. Dr. Reed: who tried to make it stop? Clara becomes agitated. They did. They put their hands on my head. They prayed. They cried. But it kept coming. There wasn't enough room for all of us. Dr. Reed's notes after the session reveal her growing unease. Patient appears to describe a dissociative episode or psychotic break. However, her cognitive faculties remain fully intact. Her implication that her parents' disappearance is connected to her condition cannot be ignored. Throughout February and March of 1916, Clara underwent numerous tests designed to verify her knowledge and determine its source. Professors from Washington University, the University of Missouri, and even 2 researchers from Johns Hopkins came to observe her, each left with more questions than answers. Clara could solve complex mathematical problems instantly without showing any work. She could draw precise astronomical charts, including systems not yet discovered, and she demonstrated knowledge of physical laws that, while consistent with current theories, seemed to leap years ahead of where science stood at the time. By early 1916, Clara's abilities were unlike anything the scientific community had ever seen. Most astonishingly, when presented with scientific journals written in German, French, or Russian, languages she had never studied, Clara could point out errors in the mathematical equations, even though she couldn't translate the words themselves. One researcher remarked, "It's as though she has access to the pure language of mathematics and physics, unfiltered by human language." By April, Clara's case had drawn national attention. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran a front-page headline, "Missouri's Miracle Child, the Girl Who Knows Too Much." While the article focused on the sensational nature of her intellect, it also briefly mentioned the still unsolved disappearance of her parents. The publicity brought waves of unwanted visitors to the hospital. Scientists, religious figures, even men claiming to represent the military, all asking to meet Clara. Most were turned away. But records show that on April 22, 1916, 2 men from the Department of War were allowed a private interview with her. No transcript of this meeting exists. Shortly afterward, Clara's health began to change. Dr. Reed's notes from late April document the first signs of decline: severe headaches, frequent nosebleeds, and pain that worsened when she attempted to write or calculate. By May, she was producing less work, but what she did write was more complex than ever, moving beyond known mathematics into something Professor Morgan described as a new language of numbers and space. Clara's physical health worsened rapidly. Records show she lost weight despite being carefully monitored. Her sleep became erratic. Sometimes she would stay awake for 50 or 60 hours, writing nonstop, then collapse into a deep, unnatural sleep where her body temperature dropped as low as 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Her behavior also began to shift. The once calm and cooperative child became agitated, sometimes aggressive. In early June, she attacked a nurse who tried to take away her papers, screaming, "The pattern isn't complete." It took 2 orderlies to restrain her, after which she fell unconscious for nearly 14 hours. When she awoke, she had no memory of the event and immediately returned to writing. Clara also began speaking about visitors who came to her room at night. Staff dismissed this as hallucination until June 14th, when night nurse Martha Cunningham recorded a chilling observation in the ward log. She heard voices from Clara's room at 2:15 a.m. and found the girl sitting upright, speaking in an unknown language mixed with numbers. When Clara saw her, she stopped and said clearly, "They're measuring how much is left. It's not enough anymore." By July, Dr. Reed began to fear that Clara's condition was not merely psychological. In a letter to Professor Morgan, she wrote, "I am forced to consider whether the knowledge itself is consuming her, that her mind is a vessel for something too vast for her body to contain." To test this theory, Dr. Reed removed Clara's writing materials for a week and kept her engaged in simple, normal activities, playing games, reading stories, walking outside. During this period, Clara's health improved dramatically. Her weight stabilized, headaches faded, and she stopped having nosebleeds. But when she was allowed to write again, Clara immediately returned to her calculations with frenzied intensity. Within hours, all her symptoms returned, worse than before. When asked why she kept writing despite the pain, Clara's response was chillingly simple. "It has to be finished. They're waiting for it." By August 1916, the hospital staff faced a grim dilemma. Clara's condition had become critical, her weight dangerously low, and fainting spells increasingly frequent. Yet, whenever her writing was taken away, she experienced such overwhelming distress that Dr. Pierce feared she might break completely. A compromise was reached. Clara would be allowed to write for limited hours each day under strict supervision. The hope was that this measured approach might slow her physical decline while doctors searched for answers. But as summer turned to fall, it became clear that something drastic would need to change if Clara Caldwell was to survive. That change came from an unexpected source. On September 7, 1916, a woman arrived at Missouri State Hospital No. 4. Identified herself as Elizabeth Caldwell, the sister of Clara's missing father, Robert Caldwell. She presented family photographs and letters that seemed to confirm her story. Hospital staff described Elizabeth as a well-dressed, educated woman in her 40s, calm and composed, but visibly shaken when reading her niece's medical records. She requested a private meeting with Dr. Pierce and Dr. Reed. No official transcript of this meeting exists, but Dr. Reed's private diary, discovered after her death in 1962, contains a chilling entry from that day. Met with EC regarding Clara. What she shared has left me deeply unsettled. Elizabeth revealed that the Caldwell family had a history of what she called episodes, sudden, inexplicable bursts of knowledge and ability. Robert Caldwell himself had experienced something similar as a boy, though never as extreme as Clara's case. The most disturbing revelation was Elizabeth's claim that 3 Caldwell children had died before reaching adulthood, all after displaying the same symptoms. She believed that Robert and Mary Caldwell had moved to the Ozarks to keep Clara hidden, to protect her from doctors and authorities if such an episode ever occurred. If Elizabeth's account was true, the questions only deepened. Where were Robert and Mary now, and why would they abandon Clara after taking such care to protect her? Within days, arrangements were made to release Clara into Elizabeth's custody. Dr. Pierce's final report stated that Clara's failing health, combined with Elizabeth's assurances that she would continue medical care in Springfield, Illinois, made it the best option. She even produced a letter, allegedly written by Robert Caldwell before his disappearance, naming Elizabeth as Clara's legal guardian. Professor Morgan objected strongly, warning that moving Clara could be dangerous, but his protests were overruled. On September 12, 1916, Clara left Missouri State Hospital with Elizabeth, traveling by automobile to Illinois. What happened next can only be reconstructed from scattered letters, hospital reports, and a partial investigation conducted years later by Professor Morgan. According to Elizabeth's letters to Dr. Reed, Clara was taken to a private home outside Springfield, where she was treated by a physician named Dr. Thomas Blackwood, described as a specialist in nervous disorders. Under his care, Clara's health reportedly stabilized. Her terrifying episodes of mathematical obsession became less frequent, and Elizabeth wrote that there were now days, even whole weeks, where Clara seemed like a normal young girl, helping the garden and playing outdoors. In her last letter to Dr. Reed, dated March 1918, Elizabeth wrote, "Clara has good days now where she seems like any young girl. Dr. Blackwood believes the episodes may cease entirely as she matures. We dare to hope for her future." This was the last known communication about Clara Caldwell. Years later, Dr. Reed's follow-up letters went unanswered. In 1920, she asked Professor Morgan to help locate Clara. His investigation uncovered something deeply disturbing. The Springfield address Elizabeth had given did not exist. There was no physician named Dr. Thomas Blackwood registered anywhere in Illinois. And most shocking of all, there was no record of Robert Caldwell ever having a sister named Elizabeth. Whoever she was, the woman who took Clara away had constructed an elaborate lie. Clara Caldwell, the brilliant, haunted child whose mind seemed to hold secrets beyond human comprehension, had vanished completely, just as her parents had. The final chapter of Clara's story comes from an unexpected source. In 1938, Dr. Harold Bennett, a researcher studying mathematical prodigies, discovered references to Clara in Professor Morgan's old papers. Intrigued, he began tracing the story, interviewing witnesses and collecting surviving records. His search led him to a sanitarium in northern Wisconsin. There, he found a woman in her mid-30s who had been a patient since 1924. She was registered only as Jane Doe, silent and withdrawn. She spent her days endlessly filling notebooks with strange, abstract symbols that no one could decipher. Dr. Ruth Crawford, the attending physician, told Bennett that the woman, known only as Jane Doe, had been brought to facility years earlier by a middle-aged woman who paid 10 years of care in advance and never returned. The woman claimed Jane was her niece, traumatized by the death of her parents, but provided no documentation to confirm her identity. When Bennett showed Dr. Crawford photographs of Clara Caldwell from Missouri State Hospital No. 4, she immediately noted the resemblance, though the years had clearly taken their toll. What finally convinced Bennett was not her face, but her notebooks. They contained a direct continuation of Clara's childhood work, a seamless evolution of the strange mathematical language she had begun writing in 1916. Bennett visited the sanitarium several times over the following year, trying to communicate with the woman he was now certain was Clara. In his notes, later published posthumously in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, he described his limited success. On his fourth visit, the woman looked at him for the first time in nearly 15 years and spoke the only words ever recorded from her. "It's almost complete now. They're coming back for it soon." 3 days later, on January 17, 1940, she was found dead at her desk, pen still in hand, as if she had finished her final calculation moments before her heart stopped. The nurse who discovered her described her expression as peaceful, almost relieved. Bennett collected the notebooks, 16 years' worth of calculations, for study. Mathematicians who reviewed them described the work as revolutionary but incomprehensible, following a logic that fit no known mathematical framework. In 1954, Bennett's research materials, including the sanitarium notebooks, were reportedly seized by government officials. Bennett himself soon accepted a position with a classified research program and never spoke publicly about Clara again. The original notebooks from 1915 and 1916, the ones collected by Professor Morgan, were never found. The final twist came in 1962, when construction crews clearing land near the Caldwell property unearthed human remains. Forensic analysis suggested a man and woman, roughly in their 30s, who had died between late 1915 and early 1916. Though identification was impossible, all evidence pointed to Robert and Mary Caldwell. What was most unsettling was how they had been found. Their bones were arranged in precise geometric pattern, one investigator recognized as an equation, written in the same strange notation as Clara's earliest work. In 1963, Shannon County officially closed the case. Robert and Mary Caldwell, deceased by unknown means. Clara Caldwell, whereabouts unknown, presumed deceased. But official records cannot answer to the most haunting questions. What happened in that cabin during the winter of 1915? What knowledge took hold of Clara's mind? Knowledge so vast that her body cannot contain it. And who, or what, was waiting for the result of her calculations? Modern experts who have studied the surviving fragments say her work anticipated quantum mechanics, string theory, even multidimensional mathematics, decades before these ideas existed in mainstream science. Skeptics argue that Clara was a tragic prodigy whose gift destroyed her, that her story was one of mental illness and coincidence. But that explanation does not account for the disappearance of her parents, nor the geometric graves found nearly 50 years later. In the Shannon County Historical Society, a single surviving page of Clara's work is displayed under glass. The equations remain indecipherable, but in the margin, written carefully in a young girl's hand, is one final message. The knowing wants out. It wasn't meant to stay inside something as small as a person. Some secrets are better left buried in the Ozark woods, where the wind still howls through the pines, and locals still avoid the overgrown trail leading to the site of the old Caldwell cabin. And if you ever stand there in the dead of winter, you might still hear it. The faint, endless sound of a pencil scratching on paper. On paper, calculating truths too vast for our understanding. Waiting for someone else who might finally give the knowing room to escape. What happened to Dr. Reed and Professor Morgan, the two people most involved in Clara's case, adds yet another eerie layer to this story. Dr. Eleanor Reed continued working at Missouri State Hospital No. 4 until 1924, when she abruptly resigned. Former colleagues said she had become obsessed with Clara's case, spending nearly all of her free time studying the few surviving copies of Clara's work. Dr. Olivia Wesson, who replaced Reed, later told a local newspaper that Reed had begun suffering from severe headaches and nosebleeds in her final months, symptoms disturbingly similar to Clara's. Eleanor would lock herself in her office for hours, just staring at those notebooks, Weston recalled. She swore there was a hidden pattern, a message buried inside numbers. Once, she even said she could hear them whispering if she stared too long. Reed moved to a cottage near Table Rock Lake, living in isolation until her death in 1962. Among her belongings was a journal describing recurring dreams, strange, geometric landscapes filled with what she called entities of pure mathematics. In one of her last entries, just weeks before her death, she wrote, "I understand now what Clara meant. The knowing doesn't want to be locked inside us. It wants vessels, pathways, ways to flow between worlds. We were never meant to contain it." Professor James Morgan stayed at the University of Missouri until his retirement in 1942, but his career never recovered. His obsession with the Caldwell case consumed him, leaving him isolated and ridiculed by peers. Students who visited his apartment said the walls were completely covered with Clara's equations and diagrams. In 1938, he published his final paper, Theoretical Frameworks for Nonlinear Knowledge Acquisition in Developing Minds. Although he never mentioned Clara by name, everyone familiar with the case recognized it for what it was: Morgan's desperate attempt to explain what had happened to her. The paper was dismissed as the mathematical equivalent of a ghost story. Morgan died in 1948 after a stroke. His research assistant, Evelyn Hartley, said she discovered a sealed envelope among his papers with instructions not to open it until 1975. Yet by the time researchers asked to see it, the university claimed it no longer existed. The Caldwell family cabin itself became part of local legend. After Clara was taken away, the property stood abandoned for years. At first, the authorities kept it sealed off, but eventually it was left to rot. By the 1930s, it had become a dare for local teenagers to spend the night there. Some claimed they felt strange headaches, disorientation, and even saw numbers and equations appearing in their thoughts. In 1939, 2 boys vanished while attempting to spend the night at the cabin. They were found days later wandering through the woods. Confused and unable to explain what had happened, the sheriff ordered the cabin burned to the ground. The land stayed empty until 1952, when it was purchased by the Missouri Department of Conservation. Rangers working near the site often reported compass malfunctions and strange atmospheric effects, like shimmering air that moved in deliberate geometric patterns, even in the middle of winter. In 1958, a small geological survey station was built near the site. Locals noticed that the people working there wore unmarked military-style uniforms and used unusual equipment flown in by helicopter. After 8 months, the station was suddenly abandoned and no official reports were ever released. What makes the Caldwell case so unsettling is how it connects to several classified research projects after World War II. Dr. Harold Bennett, the researcher who located Jane Doe in Wisconsin, joined one of these projects in 1955. Later revealed to be part of a government investigation into unusual cognitive phenomena. Most of their work focused on ESP and remote viewing, but declassified documents mention knowledge acquisition anomalies and non-standard information transfer, terms that sound eerily similar to what happened to Clara. Dr. Thomas Hargrove, a physicist who briefly worked with Bennett, later wrote that the government compiled a database of children like Clara, kids between 8 and 14 who suddenly, inexplicably, gained knowledge far beyond their age or education, experienced severe physical and psychological effects after their episodes. Hargrove's notes suggest at least 17 such cases were documented between 1890 and 1950. Clara's, however, was considered the most extreme and most thoroughly recorded. Perhaps the most chilling development in the Caldwell case came in 1967, when Professor Miriam Lancaster of Princeton University analyzed a few surviving samples of Clara's work. Lancaster, an expert in mathematical linguistics, identified striking structural similarities between Clara's symbols and mathematical concepts that would not officially be developed until the 1940s and 50s. What disturbed Lancaster most was not just that an uneducated child seemed to grasp these principles decades before the discovery, but that Clara's versions were more advanced than our current understanding. It's as if she wasn't discovering them, Lancaster wrote, but remembering them. Her paper caused a brief stir in mathematical circles, but was quickly dismissed, or perhaps quietly buried. Lancaster had planned to publish a deeper analysis, but abruptly abandoned the project after receiving an unexpected job offer from a defense contractor. She was required to relocate and sign strict confidentiality agreements. Over the decades, many researchers tried to reconstruct Clara's story, but strange obstacles kept appearing. Archival records vanished. Witnesses became unwilling to speak. Funding for projects connected to her case was suddenly withdrawn. By the 1970s, the Caldwell case had nearly faded from memory, surviving only in obscure academic papers and local legend. But in 1978, the mystery flared back to life. Dr. Rachel Norton, an astronomer at the Lowell Observatory in Arizona, was analyzing unusual radio signals from deep space when she noticed a familiar pattern. Searching her personal library, she found an old journal containing reproductions of Clara's equations. The similarity was undeniable. In an unpublished paper, Norton proposed a chilling idea. What if Clara Caldwell wasn't inventing these systems at all, but transcribing them? What if she was somehow receiving transmissions from somewhere else? And most disturbingly, what if whatever was transmitting recognized her as the perfect vessel? Norton's theory remained secret until her death in 1994, when her papers were donated to the SETI Institute archives. By then, Everyone who had personally known Clara had passed away, taking with them the last direct connections to the case. Clara's story might have ended there, an eerie scientific footnote, if not for a series of events beginning in 2014. In April that year, Dr. Michelle Chun, a theoretical physicist at MIT, published a paper on quantum information theory referencing what she called the Caldwell equations. She claimed to have discovered them in recently declassified documents from the 1950s. According to Chun, the equations predicted certain quantum behaviors that scientists had only just begun to observe in the lab. When colleagues asked her to release the source documents, Chun first agreed, then suddenly withdrew the paper and took an extended leave of absence. When she returned 3 months later, she refused to discuss the work. When questioned by MIT's Research Ethics Committee, she claimed to have no memory of ever writing the paper, despite multiple colleagues confirming they had discussed it with her. Later that same year, a private collection of early 20th century documents went up for auction in Chicago. Before the Smithsonian Institution could acquire them, a court order citing national security interests blocked the sale. The documents vanished from the record, but witnesses claimed they contained original materials from a Caldwell case, including mathematical notes in a child's handwriting. Then in 2019, construction workers at the University of Missouri unearthed a small lead seal box beneath what had once been Professor Morgan's office. Inside were a journal and several photographic plates. The university initially announced plans to publish them, but reversed its decision within days. Officials claiming to represent the Department of Energy removed the materials, which have never been seen again. So, what are we to make of the story of Clara Caldwell, the girl who somehow accessed knowledge still beyond us more than a century later? Was she simply a brilliant, unrecognized prodigy? Was her case an early example of savant syndrome triggered by trauma? Or does her story hint at something much stranger, that the human mind, under certain conditions, might receive knowledge from a source beyond our world? If so, what is that source? And what does it want from those it chooses as vessels? The Ozark Mountains guard their secrets well. The exact location of the Caldwell cabin has been lost, erased from maps, and known only to a handful of state officials who are reportedly told to stay away.